Ask any American about the deadliest day in their nation's history, and they'll likely say Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, 2,403 dead. Others might say September 11th, 2001, 2,977 lives lost. They'd be wrong. The deadliest day in American history happened on September 8th, 1900, in a city that thought it was invincible. Between sunrise and sunset, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people died, more than Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and Hurricane Katrina combined. In a single afternoon, 1 in 6 residents of Galveston, Texas, simply ceased to exist. This wasn't an act of war. This wasn't terrorism. This was nature unleashing its full fury on a city that refused to believe it was in danger. This is the story of the Great Galveston Hurricane, the disaster that killed more Americans in one day than any other event in history, and how one terrible storm changed the way America thinks about natural disasters. In 1900, Galveston wasn't just another Texas town. It was the city of Texas, the wealthiest, most sophisticated, most important in the entire state. Sitting on a narrow barrier island, it rose just 8.7 feet above sea level. But that low profile came with massive advantages. Its harbor made it the third busiest port in the U.S. Cotton flowed to markets worldwide, and money poured into the city. Galveston boasted electric lights, streetcars, and the Wall Street of the Southwest. Opera houses hosted world-class performers. Victorian mansions lined Broadway, showcasing styles from across the world. In 1900, Galveston was truly thriving. The population had swelled to 37,000, diverse, cosmopolitan, ambitious. German immigrants, freed slaves, Mexican laborers, and wealthy white families all called Galveston home. It was a place where fortunes were made, where culture flourished, where the future looked bright. There was just one problem that most residents refused to acknowledge. The island was a natural death trap. Galveston had no natural protection from Gulf storms. No hills, no high ground, nothing to break a storm surge. The entire city sat barely above sea level, completely exposed to whatever the Gulf of Mexico wanted to throw at it. Some worried. In the late 1890s, civil engineer Henry Martin Robert, yes, the same Robert who wrote Robert's Rules of Order, had surveyed Galveston and recommended building a seawall to protect against hurricanes. The city leaders rejected his proposal. Too expensive, too pessimistic, unnecessary. After all, Galveston had weathered storms before. Nothing catastrophic had happened. Why would it now? This confidence wasn't entirely unfounded. The deadliest hurricane to hit Texas before 1900 had killed about 700 people at Indianola in 1886. Terrible, yes, but survivable. What Galveston's leaders didn't understand was that hurricane science in 1900 was practically non-existent. Meteorologists couldn't track storms across the ocean. They had no satellites, no aircraft reconnaissance, no computer models. They barely understood how hurricanes formed, let alone how to predict their path or intensity. The U.S. Weather Bureau, predecessor to the National Weather Service, had only been established in 1890. Their forecasting methods were primitive at best. When a hurricane was forming in the Atlantic or Caribbean, American forecasters often didn't know about it until ships encountered it and radioed back reports. Even then, predicting where a storm would go was mostly guesswork. In early September 1900, Cuban meteorologists noticed a tropical storm forming near the Cape Verde Islands off Africa. The storm tracked westward across the Atlantic, intensifying as it moved. By September 4th, it had become a hurricane and was approaching Cuba. Cuban forecasters, who had developed more sophisticated hurricane tracking methods than their American counterparts, warned that this storm was headed for the Gulf of Mexico and potentially toward Texas. The U.S. Weather Bureau dismissed their warnings. Institutional rivalry and national pride trumped scientific cooperation. American meteorologists insisted the storm would curve northeast, away from the Gulf, following typical hurricane patterns. They were catastrophically wrong. Friday, September 7th, started normally in Galveston. The weather was pleasant. Ships moved in and out of the harbor. People went about their business. But by evening, the Gulf had begun to behave strangely. The waves grew higher. The tide came in faster and stronger than expected. Still, few people worried. Storms were common along the Gulf Coast. Dr. Isaac Klein, the chief meteorologist at the Galveston Weather Bureau office, had noticed the unusual sea conditions. By Friday night, he suspected a significant storm was approaching, but he had no idea how significant. Early Saturday morning, September 8th, the sky was overcast. Rain fell steadily. The wind picked up. The tide continued rising, unusual for early morning, when it should have been going out. By 9 a.m., water was flooding the city. Galveston flooded often, so people moved furniture and waited for it to recede. But it didn't recede. It kept rising. Dr. Klein rode through the streets, warning everyone to move to higher ground. But the highest point was barely 9 feet above sea level. The island was being swallowed. By noon, the situation was dire. 100-mile-per-hour winds tore roofs from buildings as the massive storm surge began. Imagine a 15-foot wall of water moving as fast as a galloping horse. When it hit Galveston, it didn't just flood the island. It consumed it. Neighborhoods vanished in minutes. Houses were ripped from foundations and smashed to pieces, becoming battering rams. Within hours, thousands of structures were obliterated. People were trapped as water rose through floors. Some climbed into attics, but the water kept coming. Families used axes to chop through roofs, desperate to escape drowning. Rooftops were a nightmare. Winds of 145 miles per hour peeled people off like leaves. Debris, tiles, planks, trees flew through the air like deadly projectiles. The surge rose, 10, 12, 15 feet. Half the island was underwater. Dr. Klein's own house, which had become a refuge for his family and several neighbors, began to collapse. Klein, his wife, and their 3 daughters, along with about 50 other people, tried to evacuate. As they fled through the howling darkness, a wave of debris slammed into them. Klein managed to grab his daughters and pull them onto floating wreckage. His wife disappeared into the chaos. He never saw her again. All across Galveston, similar scenes played out thousands of times. Families torn apart, children swept from parents' arms, entire groups of people clinging to debris, only to have the next wave scatter them into the darkness. The Ursuline Convent and Academy, built of sturdy brick, became a refuge for hundreds. The building survived, though barely. The nuns tied children to themselves with rope to prevent them from being washed away when water flooded the upper floors. At St. Mary's Orphanage, about 10 miles from the city center, 93 children and 10 nuns faced the storm in a large wooden building. As the water rose, the nuns tied groups of children together so they wouldn't be separated. When the building collapsed, not a single person survived. Days later, rescuers found some of the children still tied together, drowned as one. The horror peaked around 7:30 p.m. when the storm surge reached its maximum height, estimated at 15 feet or higher in some areas. At this point, wind speeds may have exceeded 150 miles per hour, making this a Category 4 hurricane by modern standards, possibly even touching Category 5 intensity. Then, around 8 p.m., the eye of the hurricane passed directly over Galveston. For about 30 minutes, the wind stopped. The rain ceased. Survivors emerged from their wreckage, thinking the storm had passed. Some people, dazed and injured, wandered the flooded streets in the eerie calm. Then the backside of the hurricane hit. The wind reversed direction, now blowing from the north at full force. The debris that had been pushed south now came roaring back through the city from the opposite direction. People who'd emerged during the eye were caught in the open and killed. By 11 p.m., the worst was over. The wind began to subside. The storm surge started to recede, but Galveston had been fundamentally destroyed. Dawn on September 9th revealed a landscape of total devastation. Over 3,600 houses had been completely destroyed, more than half the city's buildings. Another 2,600 were severely damaged. The entire beachfront was gone, every single structure wiped clean as if they'd never existed. Bodies were everywhere, in the streets, in the wreckage, floating in the receding waters, hanging from trees, buried under debris. The exact death toll will never be known because many victims were never found. Their bodies swept out to sea or buried so deep in the wreckage that they were never recovered. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 6,000. Some historians believe it was closer to 8,000. The highest estimates suggest 12,000 people died, 1 in 6 residents of Galveston killed in a single afternoon. For context, that's more deaths than Pearl Harbor, 2,403, 9/11, 2,977, Hurricane Katrina, 1,833, the Chicago Fire, 300, the San Francisco earthquake, 3,000. All combined, they still don't reach Galveston's death toll. The survivors faced an immediate nightmare: what to do with thousands of corpses in hot, humid weather. Galveston sits on the Gulf Coast where temperatures in September still hover around 90 degrees. Bodies decompose rapidly in such conditions. Disease was an immediate concern. Cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses spread through corpses. The city was in danger of facing a second catastrophe, a plague that could kill the survivors. Initially, authorities tried to bury the dead, but there were too many bodies. The ground was too saturated to dig proper graves. Workers couldn't keep up, so they made a horrible decision. They would take the bodies out to sea. Work crews loaded corpses onto barges, dozens, sometimes hundreds at a time. They weighted the bodies down and dumped them several miles offshore, hoping the Gulf currents would carry them away. But the sea rejected them. Within days, bodies began washing back onto Galveston's beaches. The weights hadn't been sufficient. The currents brought them home. Faced with this macabre failure, authorities decided on a more drastic solution: mass cremation. Massive funeral pyres were constructed throughout the city. Bodies were stacked on timber, doused in kerosene and oil, and set ablaze. The fires burned day and night for weeks. The smell, burning wood, kerosene, and human flesh hung over Galveston like a shroud. Workers who recovered bodies often tied handkerchiefs over their faces soaked in whiskey or camphor to mask the smell. Many of these workers were volunteers. Others were prisoners from the Texas prison system, pressed into service. Some were never the same after weeks of handling thousands of corpses. The recovery work was traumatizing beyond description. Workers found entire families drowned together, still holding hands. They found mothers clutching infants. They found people who'd almost made it. Bodies discovered inches from safety, killed at the last moment. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, arrived with relief workers on September 17th. At 78 years old, she'd seen devastation before: the Civil War, the Johnstown flood, but Galveston shocked even her. She described it as a great desert of desolation. The wreckage stretched for miles. Some areas were so thoroughly destroyed that it was impossible to tell where buildings had once stood. Property lines disappeared. Entire blocks were reduced to splinters. But amid the horror, something remarkable happened. Galveston refused to die. Most cities would have been abandoned after such devastation. The smart move would have been to relocate inland, to higher ground, away from the Gulf's deadly reach. Galveston did the opposite. They decided to stay, and to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. The recovery began immediately. Within days of the storm, businesses were reopening in whatever structures remained standing. Ships began returning to the port within a week. The city's leaders, many of whom had lost family members in their own homes, threw themselves into rebuilding. But they knew that simply rebuilding wasn't enough. The city needed protection. Enter 2 massive engineering projects that would reshape Galveston forever: the seawall and the grade raising. The seawall was proposed almost immediately after the storm. This time, there was no debate about cost or necessity. Everyone understood. Construction began in 1902. The wall would be 17 feet high, 16 feet wide at its base, and stretch for 3 miles along the Gulf side of the island. It was designed to break the force of storm surges before they reached the city. But a wall alone wasn't enough. Most of Galveston still sat at or below sea level. The next major storm could simply flood over the island from the bay side. So the city embarked on one of the most audacious engineering projects in American history. They raised the entire city. The Grade Raising Project, as it was called, involved literally lifting every building in Galveston and filling in underneath them to raise the island's elevation. Over 2,100 buildings, homes, churches, schools, businesses were jacked up on stilts. Some were raised as much as 17 feet. Then came the truly massive part, filling in underneath the entire city. Engineers needed millions of cubic yards of sand to raise the grade. They dredged sand from the Galveston ship channel and pumped it through massive pipelines onto the island. The sand was then distributed, leveled, and compacted to create a new surface level across 500 city blocks. Imagine living in a house that's been jacked 15 feet into the air while sand is pumped underneath it for months. Imagine navigating a city where some buildings are still at the old level while others have already been raised, creating bizarre height differences on every block. The project took 7 years and cost $1.5 million, about $50 million in today's money. Streets that had once been level were now on different planes. Staircases had to be built to access some buildings. It was chaotic, expensive, and absolutely necessary. By 1904, the seawall was complete. By 1910, the grade raising was finished. Galveston had been transformed from a flat, vulnerable sandbar into a fortified city behind a massive concrete wall raised substantially above its original elevation. The work wasn't done. Over the following decades, the seawall was extended multiple times. Today it stretches for 10 miles and stands as one of the longest continuous seawalls in the United States. And it worked. In 1915, another major hurricane struck Galveston, similar intensity to the 1900 storm. The seawall held. The raised grade kept most of the city above the storm surge. Only 8 people died, compared to thousands in 1900. But the 1900 storm had done more than kill thousands. It had fundamentally altered Galveston's trajectory. Before the storm, Galveston was positioned to become one of America's great cities, perhaps the dominant city of the Southwest. The hurricane changed everything. Houston, which had suffered minimal damage from the storm, seized the opportunity. Business leaders convinced the federal government to invest in developing Houston's port instead of rebuilding Galveston's. The Houston ship channel was deepened and expanded. Rail lines that had once terminated in Galveston were rerouted to Houston. Within 2 decades, Houston had surpassed Galveston in population, wealth, and importance. The city that had once been a sleepy inland town became the metropolis we know today, while Galveston's growth stagnated. But Galveston's impact on America extended far beyond economics. The disaster fundamentally changed how the United States thinks about and responds to natural catastrophes. Before Galveston, disaster response was mostly local and ad hoc. Communities hit by floods or fires were largely on their own. The federal government rarely intervened except to send army troops for security. The Galveston hurricane was too big to ignore. Clara Barton's Red Cross coordinated relief efforts on an unprecedented scale. The federal government sent aid. Donations poured in from across the country and around the world. More importantly, the disaster exposed critical failures in weather forecasting and communication. The fact that Cuban meteorologists had predicted the storm's path, while American forecasters dismissed their warnings, resulting in thousands of preventable deaths, was a national embarrassment. The U.S. Weather Bureau began working more closely with international meteorologists. Forecasting methods improved. Communication systems were upgraded. The foundation was laid for the National Weather Service we have today. The storm also sparked a broader conversation about building codes, coastal development, and disaster preparedness. Cities began taking hurricane risks more seriously. Seawalls were constructed in other vulnerable coastal communities. Building standards were strengthened. In 1906, the Galveston City Commission government was established, one of the first examples of commission-based city governance in America. Born from the chaos of post-storm recovery, this model spread to hundreds of other American cities. Perhaps most significantly, Galveston taught America a hard lesson about the power of nature and the danger of hubris. The confident belief that human progress had made communities immune to natural disasters was shattered. Americans learned, or should have learned, that no matter how wealthy, modern, or sophisticated a city becomes, nature can destroy it in an afternoon. It's a lesson that bears repeating. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, Hurricane Ian in 2022. Every few years, another storm reminds us that coastal communities remain vulnerable, that engineering solutions have limits, that nature still has the final word. Galveston survived because it learned this lesson and adapted. The seawall and grade raising represented an acknowledgement. We can't prevent hurricanes, but we can prepare for them. We can build with nature's fury in mind. Today, Galveston is a city of about 50,000 people, a popular tourist destination known for its beaches, its historic architecture, and its resilience. The Strand, once destroyed, has been restored and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The seawall remains, stronger and longer than ever. On clear days, you can walk along it and look out at the Gulf, beautiful, peaceful, deceptive in its calm. Memorials throughout the city remember the dead. At the site of St. Mary's Orphanage, a monument depicts the nuns tying the children together in their final moments. At the 1900 Storm Memorial and Remembrance Garden, families leave flowers and remember the thousands whose names were lost. Every year on September 8th, Galveston holds a memorial ceremony. Survivors' descendants gather. The names of identified victims are read aloud. A moment of silence honors the thousands whose names were never recorded, whose bodies were never found, whose families simply disappeared. Because that's what the Great Galveston Hurricane really was, an erasure. Entire families gone. Complete neighborhoods wiped from existence. Thousands of individual stories ended abruptly on a September afternoon. September 8th, 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. More Americans died that day than on any other single day, yet it's largely forgotten, overshadowed by more recent events. But for emergency managers, Galveston remains a touchstone. It's the cautionary tale that never gets old. It's the reminder that preparation matters, that forecasting saves lives, that hubris kills. The Great Galveston Hurricane taught America that no city is too modern to be destroyed by nature. It proved that geography matters more than confidence. And it demonstrated that how we respond, how we prepare, rebuild, and learn, determines whether catastrophe becomes extinction or merely a chapter in a longer story.
Galveston chose survival. It chose adaptation. It chose to remember. And in doing so, it changed how America faces the next storm. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more forgotten chapters of history that shaped the modern world. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive. And let us know in the comments, what other forgotten disasters should we explore? Because the best way to honor those who didn't survive is to remember what happened and to make sure we're ready when nature's fury returns. Thank you for watching.